Not long ago, Hillary Clinton posted to her website her plan to curb gun violence. It's broken down into three main proposals: universal background checks, to hold dealers and manufacturers accountable if they endanger Americans, and to keep guns out of the hands of domestic abusers, other violent criminals, and the severely mentally ill. Now, none of this is surprising or new. What struck me is the way she justifies these measures. Here are her core arguments. First, she justifies her push for gun control by stating there are 33,000 gun deaths in the U.S. per year. And this is true. And it sounds like a big number. But first, you have to realize that 2/3 of these deaths are suicide. And secondly, and more importantly, in order for this to be an argument for gun control, you have to believe that the proposed measures would reduce these numbers. And they wouldn't. But you don't have to take my word for it. In studying the effects of gun control, neither the CDC nor the National Academy of Sciences were able to find any correlation between gun laws and violent crime and suicide rates. In other words, when official organizations have studied it, they have consistently found that gun control has no effect on violent crime or suicide. So the inference that the proposed measures could reduce these numbers is, by the evidence, false. Next, she justifies her push for universal background checks by stating that 40% of gun sales occur without a background check. Now, this number is based on a 1997 NIJ report, which is based on a 1994 survey. Now, two interesting things about this survey. First, it included only 251 respondents. And second, it was conducted exclusively prior to the Brady Bill passing. In other words, at the time that this survey was conducted, federal background checks were not required or available. Now, some states required their own background checks, and many others did not. So the results of this survey are not surprising. Of course, today, federal background checks are required for every single dealer sale, regardless of location, as well as for any sale that occurs across state lines. So the numbers would be quite different today. If we want a more up-to-date number, one that's applicable to today's situation, we can look at Colorado and Washington State, both of which have universal background checks. If we do that, we find that private sales make up 4% of total sales. 4, not 40. But some may still ask, could universal background checks prevent some criminals from getting guns? Well, to answer this, we turn to a 2013 study that asked inmates, convicted criminals, where they got their guns. The study found that only a negligible number were purchased firsthand through non-illicit sales. In other words, criminals get their guns illegally, not through legal private sales at gun shows or off Craigslist. Now, to think that two criminals knowingly involved in an illegal sale would voluntarily go get a background check is ridiculous on the face of it. Universal background checks do absolutely nothing to keep guns out of the hands of criminals, and the inference that they do is just as false as that 40% claim. Next, she claims that the firearms industry has a special immunity that protects them from negligent or criminal acts. Now, there is a law in the books called the Protection and Lawful Commerce in Arms Act that was modeled after a similar act that protects non-negligent aviation companies from frivolous lawsuits. Now, it's important to mention that neither law does anything to protect a negligent company against lawsuits. Now, I'm a pilot and a shooter, so it's been very clear to me for a long time that these are two things that can strike unreasonable fear into the hearts of many. And it's this fear that makes it easy to convince a civil jury to rule against a non-negligent manufacturer for the misuse of their product, where they would never rule against Toyota or Ford for the acts of a drunk driver. This type of frivolous lawsuit drove more than one aviation company out of business prior to these protections. So when anti-gun groups began bringing this type of frivolous suit against firearm companies with the stated purpose of driving them out of business, Congress took action, and this law was the result. This law's purpose is to protect non-negligent dealers and manufacturers from frivolous and malicious lawsuits. It does nothing to protect criminal or negligent dealers or manufacturers. Next, she claims that domestic abusers and those with mental illness have legal access to guns and that straw purchasing is not a federal crime. Well, the before-mentioned 2013 study, affirming what other similar studies have found that straw purchasing is the #1 way that criminals get guns. Now, a straw purchase in essence is when somebody that can pass a background check goes and buys a gun for somebody else who cannot. In this section, Clinton claims that straw purchasing is a paperwork violation and should be a federal crime. Well, it already is a federal crime, one punishable by 10 years in federal prison. But it's almost never prosecuted, despite urgings to prosecute by the NRA and other gun rights groups. So while it's true that background checks have stopped 2.4 million sales, only a very tiny handful of those were ever prosecuted, leaving almost all of them free to go acquire a gun through different means. What good is a law if you don't enforce it? And how would another law make it any better? Clinton then claims that she would keep guns out of the hands of domestic abusers and the severely mentally ill. What she again fails to mention is that convicted domestic abusers and those adjudicated mentally ill, as well as anyone who has a restraining order out against them, are currently, under federal law, prohibited from purchasing a firearm. What she wants to do is circumvent due process and permanently take the rights of anyone who's even accused of one of these things. Now, this whole thing is posted to Clinton's website and is presumably intended for her supporters. Yet all 4 of her core arguments are misleading or factually false. Now let that sink in a bit. She's misleading her own supporters to push this agenda. Well, that's because the only way you can make a convincing argument for these measures is to mislead.